Hi everyone, this is Yuri Rashkin, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, and perhaps even right here around us. I was asked to come and speak at a rally yesterday in Walworth County by my dear friend Ellen Hawley, and it was and Mary Burke, and it was really wonderful to be there and to speak to so many people who are, so much in support of a country across the world that is fighting for survival against pretty impressive odds and is doing a remarkable job. And all of that is so far away, and sometimes it seems like it's not our fight. And it was incredible to see so many people who came out and showed their support. So, what I do in this situation is I really, well, first of all, I'm looking to answer your questions, which is awesome. Thank you very much. But second, look at this. And the sound is working. So, that's another way that I can now track the comments. This is good stuff. Good stuff, everybody. So, we have at least three different perspectives, but we really have a lot more that we can discuss because we have the American perspective, we have the Ukrainian perspective, we have Russian perspective, and then we have at least European perspective, but we also have a Chinese perspective and maybe even Indian perspective. This is really interesting stuff if you're into geopolitics. I was never into playing Risk as a game. I guess we're just playing it in real time, real life. So, what is going on here? That we have, well, if it's going to ding, it's going to ding, right? There we go. Because I'm streaming on Facebook, so I can't very well actually close Facebook. That's a sneaky thing Facebook did. So if you're sending me messages right now, please hold off. But who knows what's happening? So, Russia. That's where I'm from. That's the place that I kind of sort of know a little bit. I mean, I've never been to Ukraine, so this is a big, big educational experience for me as well. But here, let's start with Russia. Russia is Russian people seem to have no control over who runs the show in Russia. And I think that should be acknowledged in both bad and the good. So if their government in Russia is doing terrible things, that doesn't mean necessarily that people support it or don't support it. It just, their opinion really just doesn't matter. However, what we're seeing right now is an absolute mass hysteria that came about as a result of the developments we've seen worldwide, started by Vladimir Putin on 24th of February. Since then, Russia entered a war that it calls a special operation. You may recall a famous novel by Leo Tolstoy, Special Operation and Peace. Yes, so that's what they have to do in Russia. And in fact, one of the things I heard is that people are having a hard time even telling jokes in Russia now because so many words can get them into trouble. How did they go from a country that was, appearing to be part of the West in some kind of way to a country that is really not part of anything anymore, just kind of a pariah state? Which is what they were for over 70 years as Soviet Union. It's an interesting trajectory because first, a war was started under totally false pretenses. After that, and this was actually a continuation of a conflict war that started in 2014. But just so we're clear, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and parts of Donbas region, and so from that point on, the conflict has been going on. But on 24th of February this year, Russia decided to go full blast and first recognize these territories, the republics in Donbass, as independent, then accepting them, showing them support and moving in troops. And it was very clear at that point, as we all know, what was happening at that point. But if you're in Russia, situation looks very different because you were told that for 8 years there was genocide of people taking place in Donbas region where people were just killed for no reason. Because I'm a big believer, I guess, in projection, and especially when it comes to Russian propaganda. When they tell people that they're accusing them of genocide, you can be rest assured that's what they're planning on doing. So after that, after revealing their plans in Ukraine, Russia proceeded to invade, and we'll talk about how that has been going in a second. But first, let's stick with Russia just for the sake of consistency, really. Russia invades. Russia does not do very well from the military point of view, but people seem getting to be more and more excited. I mean, there is no news from the front in Ukraine, so what's good though, this is the thing that I think is a thought, is that Russia for so many years has been told, Russian people living in Russia, it's a big question, but let's say people living in Russia, they've been told for so many years that the West and America is against them, that America and the West has put them on their knees, and then Mr. Putin raised Russia off its knees, and so on, that now, on some level, it feels like they are finally starting to punch back at those horrible people led by the so-called Nazis of Ukraine. It is a very confusing question and really kind of highlights the power of propaganda. So then what happens is all of a sudden Russian people notice that stores are closing, restaurants are leaving, businesses are going away, Western businesses, and they're going, oh, we don't care, everything's fine, everything's going to be great. We are, we'll have Chinese stuff now come in and just replace those brands with other brands. We'll have some, it's going to be like Soviet Union, but, better because free market, and we can do this because we're great. And that's something I find I saw a lot of Soviet Union propaganda, and you can see it in North Korean propaganda. The worse each individual person is doing, the more they're concerned about the glory of the state. So the worse Russian people are going to be doing, what is that going to, that's a different conclusion, right? Hold on that one for a second. So Russian people are now fighting and protecting and liberating, as far as they know, this territory next door, which they really never thought was a country in its own. And the thing is that Russians are very, how do I say, there's an empire mindset, imperialist, colonialism. You pick the one term that suits you best, but Russia is a land empire that has turned all these surrounding neighbors into colonies, right? We just don't have like Great Britain or France or some other state that has, empire that has territories all over the world. We really have more of the Russian approach where we don't want to go very far. We're just going to we're just going to take over our neighbors, and we're going to expand our territory to our neighbors. While Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, the mindset has very much remained, which is advocating really just looking down at everybody, because that's what a colonial empire does, right? Is there's empire, there's the headquarters, and there's everybody else. The wilderness out there. So, from the Russian point of view, another way to raise themselves has been to lower everybody else, and boom, that's where Ukraine comes in. Because the more and more that I'm hearing from Russian propaganda, they're not even viewing Ukrainians as like people. This is really terrifying if you just, take this thought in, because when you have hospitals in Ukraine, and you have birthing wards, and you have retirement homes that are clearly marked and are still bombed and people are dying, does it mean that this is done on purpose, right? There's a question of whether this is the pilot's decision or whoever gave pilot the order, but nonetheless, there's a strategy of dehumanizing, because that's part of genocide, right? We're dehumanizing the people that are being destroyed. Because if we look at them as equal, it's kind of hard to say, you're just like me, but you got to go now. On the other hand, if you look at this as people below you, then the process gets much easier. I mean, we don't ask our animals and pets for the same level of consideration, right? I mean, just kind of expand. I mean, we've heard of racism, so we should be able to relate. So continuing on, economy in Russia at the same time is not doing very well. It's doing terrible, and the confusion comes from the fact that are we really doing that poorly on the front? Are the things with our army going so poorly that we don't have sugar in stores? No, it's because the world has decided that it cannot do business with Russia anymore. And so we've done what we've done. We've instituted the most severe sanctions that have ever been. This is it. Pale, this South African Republic that was boycotted by the world was in a better position than Russia is right now. Granted, Russia has oil and gas. And that is something that everybody remembers. And Russians themselves, even Kremlin and Putin, they thought that the West would, choke themselves for an extra penny. And so they thought that those, corrupt Westerners, they'd rather save a penny than have something, nice happening. So they'll get over themselves. They'll just be, they wouldn't want to pay extra at the gas pump, so we can do whatever we want. That was a big miscalculation, but that was one of many miscalculations that Mr. Putin and Kremlin has made. For it seems like every analyst I talk to and listen to, tell me if you find it otherwise, agrees that you don't conduct a full invasion of a 40 plus million people country with 200,000 troops if you plan to occupy it. And that is a very interesting point, because is Russia really intent on occupying Ukraine, or in terms of like the traditional sense, or is it interested more in destroying the cities and destroying the country and then moving on and continuing the destruction and beyond Ukraine borders? And is this going to be just to Ukraine's neighbors, or is this going to be Ukraine's neighbors who are members of NATO? Wait, President Biden said that we're going to defend every inch of NATO's land. Okay, so let's take a deep breath there. As soon as Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th, and it became clear that the West is going to institute very severe sanctions, many people most of the people who were able to leave Russia, there's a lot of clarifications there. Not all people, but who could. So between 300,000 and possibly as many as 1 million people have left Russia since February 24th, and they are now all over the world. They are essentially have themselves become nearly refugees. Which is ironic, because you can bet that Russians look down at refugees because, refugees, it's an ethic of strength, and we'll be revisiting that topic, but refugees are weak, and, weak lose. So now hundreds of thousands of Russians all over the world are in nearly refugee status, trying to figure out where can they go, where are they going to be allowed to go. And this is not a situation that has easy answers, because on one hand, it's simple for us to say that if a person is a citizen of Russia, then they have a certain amount of culpability, accountability, and therefore their part, that they didn't do everything they could since they're still there and Putin is there, therefore go back, or we don't want to have you. And considering the amount of evil that Putin is doing right now, it's hard to really even blame people who are upset, because the situation is so dire. But nonetheless, perhaps some flexibility is needed, because we really have people who are not fighting, but opposing and doing everything that they felt was in their power, including leaving Russia to protest Putin's regime. So I hope that this is something that is going to get resolved, because the people that escaped one tyrannical regime should not be necessarily punished by, On the other hand, when we get to Ukraine, which is all of this is leading up to, as you can see by the collars, right? Ooh, by the collars, yes. So Russians, right? So you have lots of people who left. On top of that, any remnants of free media closed. So if you had one radio station gone, one TV station, which was actually already on cable, gone, or internet gone, one newspaper remaining, but they have to black out everything. It's something's going on, and people are not hearing about things, right? This is where we have the now famous Marina Ovsyannikova, producer slash editor, whatever the precise definition may be of her job title description at Russian television channel 1, where she ran out during primetime news and held up a sign of protest. There's a big question among Russians who are very suspicious by nature, probably due to history, of what is really the nature of this statement by Marina Ovsyannikova. Was she holding up a sign because she was paid to do so? Because this is attempt by Russian government to make believe falsely that the West, that not all Russian people are bad, and that there are good Russian people, and there is a ploy, right? The conspiracy theories in this situation are amazing. But nonetheless, we know that this woman went out there, did a heroic thing, and she continues to have consequences. Although, as far as I understand, she's currently in Russia, although she's giving interviews and doing her best to stand up for herself. Everything I've read about her sounds like she's like a person that everybody respects that has come into contact with her, which is really important, right? So her credibility, personal credibility and professional credibility, if she was working at Channel 1, is actually in a pretty good place. So, but the situation is nerve-wracking and people are suspicious. Things are not going well at war, as I may have mentioned, and the store's shelves are emptying out as the sanctions have created, because Russia never really made anything of any use. It was really except for weapons, because it's exchanged everything else for goods and services. Some might say that this is, how global capitalism crushed Russia, but this is also Russia not making anything at home. I think that's more of a reminder that made in the USA, matters, because if you do nothing, then, we become more vulnerable to those kinds of disruptions. And Russia is extremely, extremely vulnerable. Situation is bad over there. And what happens next? Well, Vladimir Putin says that it's anniversary. They were planning on taking Kiev in 3 days. It failed. Didn't happen like they were hoping. Didn't go. So he organizes the big celebration, quote marks, of the annexation of Crimea, because he got so much, popularity points on this when he did it first. It's clearly, he owns it now. He didn't at first because he was kind of scared to own it, but then he decided to own it. So now Crimea is his. And what is, what do we see? We see that stadium full of Russian people supporting Putin. We go, wait, are Russian people for this? Are Russian people against this? That stadium doesn't really tell you much of anything, other than there's plenty of people in Russia that can be summoned to a meeting. There was footage of video of people leaving because they were paid to be there. It's normal Russian government practice, because they, that's what they do. They put out notices saying that they're looking for people to come to this event, and people are forced to go from work. College students are forced to go by their, colleges and so on. So the whole system is set up to pressure people to attend these events. So they went, they clearly checked in, and they tried to leave, and some of them did. Nonetheless, the stadium was full of people who seemed pretty excited, taking pictures and having a good time. Not realizing that they were taking part in something that's going to be looked at like a history chronicles, when we see Germany, Nazis, the crazy stuff happening, and we're like, wow, what must have been happening there? How can they be so crazy? Well, now it's happening in Russian. So it's and it's less, I don't know to what extent it is less organized in Germany. Actually, quite a bit. I think that's one of the big strengths of the situation that we have with Russia, is that they're not Germans, they're not Chinese, they're Russians, and that means we have hope, because making things is not their strong suit. There's a joke that whenever Russians make anything, put anything assembled together, it turns into a Kalashnikov, which supposedly was also stolen from Germans as an idea. But, we'll leave that for another conversation. So things are not going well. That's kind of the refrain here, right? And so that means that Russia is doing what now? They are looking for spies and traitors and enemies. They've turned off media. They are turning off a lot of social media. Just today, I believe they announced that Facebook is now, Meta is now terrorist organization or extremist organization in Russia, which means that what I was suggesting was going to happen is likely to happen even more now, where people are afraid to log in. People are afraid to log into Facebook because it was just a question of technology. When they just flipped the switch, but it was still legal to use it, it was just no longer available. People got on technology, VPN, and so on, and they got a workaround. But now it's actually considered an extremist organization, which means that being on Facebook is going to get people in trouble. People are logging off Facebook. This is it's dreadful because that's communication. And and as much as Russia is undergoing a just and true reward for what has taken place, it's going to be terrible what's going to occur there, and it's going to be the communication part of it, the part where we're going to have potentially, over 100 million people, close to 150 million people just cut off from communication. That is going to set the country back in a lot of ways. I think in some ways we were making some strides, but now we're taking steps back, and should Russia ever come back from the cold again, it's going to take longer and it's going to be more challenging bringing them back, but this is not the time to worry about it, so we'll leave that for another day. How bad is it going to get in Russia is an open question, and it's going to get pretty bad, because the point is to keep them from even being able to make more weapons. And I think that and considering that the things that they made were weapons and everything else they bought in exchange for gas and oil, the fact that we are now we stopped buying those things from Russia, and that's great. But America, it's easier for us to do it than it is for Europe because they're much more dependent on it, right? We know. So I think that's where the curtain to some extent, almost sets on Russia for this kind of a first act of our conversation. And then let's move on to Ukraine, where we have a country that has been independent since 1991. And it's never been people in the country have not been wealthy, but the country itself is rich with various resources. But probably most importantly, it's just its wheat that it's been producing. That's why the flag is yellow and blue, because it's for the grain and for the fields and for the sky. So, and the country's been kind of dealing with a lot of corruption, like a lot of particularly poor countries do. And part of the reason that it was poor is because the money was, mismanaged, and it led to several, it led to revolutions where people rebelled against their politicians. But at the same time, life in Ukraine has always been different from Russia in a sense that Russia, since Putin came to power, has consistently observed how their liberties have been taken away and tightened, and Ukrainians have been watching this from across the border. For a long while, it seemed like Russia was still a more desirable way to go for those that were moving because the incomes there were higher. But over time, it appears that the situation has stopped being quite so one-sided. And now, for the last several years, people have been really running and escaping from Russia to Ukraine. Ukraine, being Russia's neighbor, is full of Russian speakers for a variety of reasons, including those that have got out of Russia lately. In 1994, there was such a document signed called Budapest Memorandum. Memorandum is not, in my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, I don't know to what extent it is a legal binding document. but it is a document that has that that Ukraine put their trust into, and they believed that if they got rid of their nuclear weapons and they gave them to Russia, think about how crazy this sounds now. In 1994, Ukraine turned over its nuclear weapons to Russia. In exchange, if Ukraine was going to be in trouble, then it was going to get assistance from the West and those signing it, including the United States. So when Russia invaded Ukraine first in 2014, there was a lot of talk about what happened to Budapest Memorandum. Where's the help? Why is this happening? That is a big open question that is going to be answered historically, and you know but it is an important point to remember that at some point, Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons. And one of the takeaways here, perhaps, is that if we want countries to get rid of their nuclear weapons, then we need to protect those. I mean, logically, right? Protect those that have given up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security, safety, and protection. Because otherwise, what we see is that it's just not prudent to give up your nuclear weapons. If you're a country with nuclear weapons, why give it up? That just kind of increases the chances, if not ensures, that you're going to be attacked. Because nuclear weapons is what keeps other countries at bay so far. Fast forward, a couple of revolutions, several different presidents later. 2013, 2014, there's a revolution in Ukraine. And during that revolution, when people said that they were not going to go with their leader who wanted to go back to Moscow and they wanted to go to the West, they came out on the streets and showed another way why they are not Russians. And they stood for their freedom and they stood for their collective choice, and they won. And their president ran away to Russia. Which is never a good thing. First of all, to run away to Russia, and then especially if you're a president. So I think there's some good, important lessons there to learn. But during that time, while the country was almost literally on fire, Russia used that opportunity to swiftly get into and annex a couple of territories, specifically Crimea and Donbas region, parts of Donbas region, including a couple of bigger cities. This is not the first time. This was not the first time that Russia got involved into this in a war since Putin's been in power. And this is one of the things, I guess, that we should just remember, that Ukraine war is not his first experience at this, although neither he nor his Secretary of Defense actually themselves served in the army or military forces, armed forces. This is actually possibly fifth war that they've gotten Russia into, and up until then, up until now, everything worked out for them pretty well, in their opinion. They got involved. They stopped. Had two wars with the province of Chechnya, and they crushed it to the point that we are now worried and comparing Ukraine to Chechnya. In Kiev and Kharkov and all these great cities to city of Grozny, which was leveled to the ground. And that's terrifying. Besides those, and besides Ukraine in 2014, there was also Syria, which you may recall. That was a one where Russian planes bombed and leveled Aleppo. Again, a city, brutal attack, continuous bombings. For Putin, it worked. It accomplished his goal, right? His guy remained in power. So again, he felt like he used his 1-2 punch, and it worked well for him. And then the one that we are important, we should not forget, is Georgia in 2008, which was another and potentially the biggest red flag that we've had, that Russia was not going to be sitting peacefully around, and that as a state it's going to be out attacking its neighbors. There's a big question of what we could have, should have done, but we could have had the same sanctions we have now that we could have put on Russia in 2008. This was actually, Putin has a thing for numbers. It was 08, 08, 08. or 888 when that occurred. And Russia basically tried to take and did take a portion of Georgian land. Georgia put up a fight. They brought attention of the world to it immediately. President Mikhail Saakashvili brought this to the attention of everybody, and the West did practically nothing. And it was one of those things where we send a message and we let Putin know how we're going to be responding to his aggression. Now, it is important to acknowledge that America responds differently in all democratic countries. Heck, all countries respond differently depending on who is leading them at the time. And who did we have leading our great country on 08, 08, 08? Why, it was George Bush and Dick Cheney. It is amazing that they did not help democracy defend itself, considering their track record of spreading democracy. Anyway, inconsistency. All right. History will teach us something, right? Maybe not. So, Ukraine is fighting. Ukraine was thinking that Ukraine and a lot of people thought that Putin would be stopped. Putin would not dare. Putin would not do this. Russians and Ukrainians have incredibly long connection. Putin insists they're the same people. And so to think that Putin would want to do something as horrible and horrific as he has done is almost impossible to fathom. Because, again, either he lies, which we know he does, or he's terribly bad at trying to do what he's trying to do, which we also know. So he's like a terrible liar who's terrible at doing things he's trying to do. And so Putin took his 200,000 or so man army and shoved them into Ukraine. Ukraine has put up a heroic fight, but after the blitzkrieg did not work and Putin was not able to take Kiev in 3 days, his strategy changed. It is remarkable to what extent Russia itself does not care about the state of its troops. It just boggles the mind that the number of conversations that are recorded and available on internet of Russian soldiers speaking with their mothers and telling them about the dreadful conditions that they're in. And when you look at the numbers of soldiers that Russia has lost in this conflict, it is unbelievable by really modern standards. Russia is fighting war like, the strategy of World War II with tanks. And they're absolutely putting a whole different light, is what they're doing, really, on the number of losses and casualties that Soviet Union has endured during World War II. One of Soviet Union's claim to a special place in the pantheon of countries that have defeated the Nazi Germany was that Russia suffered the greatest losses of all countries. But when you look at how Russia is suffering losses now, it kind of puts a kind of different, slightly different light, at least, on what happened in World War II, because they are terrible, absolutely terrible at using their people. It was always kind of known, but to see it on our news and to see that there's bodies, that there's between over 10,000 dead Russian soldiers already. It's an incredible number because we know that's more than we've lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is getting close to the number that Russia lost in Afghanistan in all the years of war that it was there. But at the same time, part of Putin's strategy is bombing cities to create refugees, so the refugees demand government surrender. But it's also the goal to expand. He's marching on, and as Ukrainian people are hiding in bomb shelters, they feel that World War III has already started. Because from their point of view, if you're being bombed if you have tanks, if you have war, is this a world war or is this a local war? What they're seeing is it's becoming a world conflict because they have help from all over the world, but also because it is reasonable to expect Putin to continue on. The number of troops he has, it does not give him the luxury of occupation. But if he creates disaster areas, then why even stop at Ukraine? We already know that President Biden said that we are going to defend every inch of NATO territories. But many people have said that that gave Putin a certain carte blanche in attacking other nations that are not NATO nations. And that's just a highlight to remind people that think that it's possible to pacify Putin. We can just give him something or other and everything's going to be okay. Doesn't seem to work again and again and again. So we can probably stop doing that and presume that he's going to continue, especially considering that we have made him into a pariah, and deservedly so, because he has made himself into a pariah. He started the war, and now he is on his own. It sounds like even China is not interested in helping him, and possibly India is going to do some help there because they feel like, I guess they've got 65 or 70% of their tanks from Russia, and so they have to continue stand into something or other. In my opinion, considering the sanctions, Russia might not be able to make any more tanks for India or for themselves or for anybody else. So might not be that big a deal anymore. But part of the challenge is that we have this whole world that is coming to this realization very fast, because, World War II lasted 6 years. And I think that what we're seeing for the last several weeks cannot last for 6 years. I think I have a difficult time seeing that. If you can easily imagine that, let me know. So, and so I have a YouTube channel, and I've been speaking to people in different parts of the world, and it is remarkable how different their perspective is. Because for people in Russia, they're dealing with the worsening economic situation and worsening political situation. People in Ukraine are dealing with actual war. Granted, we've, as the United States, have done an incredible job, I feel, providing assistance, and people are grateful for the assistance. However, until the bombs continue dropping, it's not going to feel like enough to us or them. And so the work continues, right? And from the point of view of people who are living in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Baltic states, this is going, they feel like the enemy is basically at the gates. The fact that they have NATO protection doesn't make them even feel all that comfortable right now, which is interesting to acknowledge as well. Because you would think President Biden has said that if you are member of NATO, you are, protected by the power of American military. And yet we have, people in Baltic states who are not necessarily all that convinced that we're going to do what we've said we're going to do, and that we're going to engage in a conflict that can potentially turn nuclear. And considering how Russian government, Soviet government likes threatening and shaking around the nuclear threat, it's an ongoing situation. Why would Putin stop now, right? On the other hand, I've had a couple of conversations today, literally, with guests from Germany, and they're still able to see the big picture. While what happens during war, I think, is that lines blur. I mean, I think that's an understatement. But one of the things that I think is occurring with people from Ukraine, people in Ukraine that I'm seeing, is that they've lost really the ability to distinguish between Russian people and Russian troops and Putin. And it seems like it's all one big, terrible thing that is attacking them. And this is leading to a lot of anger. To put it mildly, it leads to a lot of anger. On the other hand, people that are in Germany are still able to give a more reasoned a reasoned approach. But reasoned approach isn't necessarily the correct approach, because I think we're not dealing with a reasonable person. So I think what we need is we need to combine all of these perspectives, and that's what I guess I'm trying to do, is to convey to you, my dear listening audience, is all these different perspectives of what is going on in Ukraine. And in the end, it is up to you to decide if this is something that what you should, to what level you should get involved. Should you boycott the companies? Should you let them know? Should you let your politicians know? Should you let them know that Russian, like what is the level that you feel you can get engaged in? Hopefully, quite a bit. But I think that ultimately we want peace. We want peace for Ukraine. And how we're going to get there without destroying our planet is not entirely clear, and how soon we're going to get there is not entirely clear, and what is going to be left of Ukraine by the time we get there is not entirely clear. And that is a kind of an important point, because granted, more than likely the world is going to spend a lot of money in Ukraine when the fighting stops. But we are looking at infrastructure being destroyed. We're looking at people being displaced. By some account, up to 10 million people are going to be displaced by this. And this is a problem that is touching all of us, and it's going to touch all of us more. We may not be here in America, for instance, in the same situation as Russian people when they're looking at rationing of sugar, and we may not be in the position of Ukrainian people hiding in bomb shelters for weeks. I published a story from Mariupol on my Facebook page about a person and just taking a dog on a walk in a city that is surrounded, blockaded. Blockade, by the way, is a concept that Russian people know all too well, because St. Petersburg, Leningrad, was under German blockade. And it's such a big, painful chapter in Russian history. And it's remarkable to see how Russian troops are now blockading another major city that really basically has all Russian speakers as a population, with a purpose of denazifying it and liberating it from I don't even know what. So there is an argument to be made that economically we need to go for basically a complete embargo, right? Just using as an example without any judgment, but what we did with Cuba was an embargo. This is the condition state of things as it relates to Russia as well. This is not necessarily the direction we're headed in right now. Is not so much a punishment, but more of a get out. We don't want to deal with you. We can't do business with you. You are not trustworthy, and goodbye. And what effect that's going to have, we're all going to see. All right. Well, let me take this opportunity to look at some of the questions that you may have asked. Well, let's see. A question has come from a psychiatrist in Canada. I wonder over how to communicate with people who have different opinions. Valery, it is a good question. I think one of the ways is to accept that we're not always right, to accept that other people have a point of view that we need to consider. And I think that I would probably stay away from things that divide us as much as possible, because that is not a way to build bridges. But you're a psychiatrist. You tell me how it should work better. Why should I tell you? Janelle Crary. Hi, Janelle. We keep seeing groups of people, Janelle writes, here in the States talking about biochem labs in Ukraine. What are other past examples of Russian propaganda that has influenced our country, i.e., elections, foreign policy, government sentiment, etc.? This is a great, wonderful, big question that I'm going to do my best to address in parts. First of all, the biochem labs in Ukraine, I think the understanding is that this is a type of laboratory that exists all over the world, doesn't make it any particularly special, but the trope is important because, as I mentioned, Russian government, Kremlin is really very transparent because before they do something, they announce it and blame somebody else for doing that. This is why the American government has such concern that Putin is planning a chemical attack in Ukraine because speaking about chemical weapons out of the blue, who started this conversation? Where did this come from? So I think that this is where, the same way that Putin talking about denazification of Ukraine when he's clearly acting as a fascist Nazi. So, I mean, it's like, okay. So that's biochem labs. What are other past examples of Russian propaganda that have influenced our country, such as elections? Well, I mean, there's 2016. That is also, of course, a big open question because who knows exactly how much Russians were able to influence our elections. But they were clearly able to do something, and in close election, every little bit counts. So I think that's the election part. The main thing as far as foreign policy, and this is something that is particularly relevant to the situation we're in today, is that Putin's approach and something he inherited from Soviet leaders' approach has been to kind of act a little crazy, unpredictable, bizarre, with the purpose of scaring people. I don't know to what extent it is working for him because I think if it scares people, but it also makes people pretty mad, and I think that could be another one of his miscalculations. But it has worked for a long time because one of things to pay attention to is certain attitude. I mean, first of all, you can just watch Fox News and just take notes because that's like, oh, that's Kremlin propaganda. Okay, got it. But there's certain patterns to it. John Oliver on his show discussed a few years back, I remember, whataboutism. Where whenever something happens, well, they can point a finger at us and say, well, what about you? For instance, United States is the country that has used nuclear weapons twice, right? We used Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soviet Union or Russia never done that. So does that mean that what? And of course, to anything that happens bad in Russia, they can always point finger at us and say, look at how you have problems with what you're doing with black people, and that's putting it very mildly. So there's always a finger to be pointed back, and that really is a way to move the conversation from the actual topic and create kind of a feeling of what's sometimes called moral relativism, where it's all relative. Well, you do this, we do that, and, the world keeps revolving. But there's a big difference, as one writer said that, sure, United States and Soviet Union got involved in business of other countries, but when Soviet Union got involved, they got North Korea. When the United States got involved, we got South Korea. There's a difference, even though both countries got involved. It's an oversimplification, but for the purpose of this conversation, I hope it suffices and gets the point across. So those are some of the things that I think we should just be aware of in dealing with some of the impact of Russian propaganda. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how all of this is combined with, lack of funds because we froze a tremendous amount of money, but they continue to receive enough money, as was said, to pay people with sticks. And if Russia continues to receive enough money to pay people with sticks to put other people in jail and to beat people up, then Putin's regime potentially could have been pretty, long-standing. But between the sanctions and the war in Ukraine, it is pretty clear that between those two big challenges, Russian state is really moving towards a collapse. Again, the collapse of Russian state isn't necessarily bad or good, because it could go the bad way, it could go the good way, and if we want to get involved in that, that might be a bigger problem. But let's take a look at a question here from Lara. We are in third world war, looks like. The country Russia rules by criminal mafia. Nuclear weapon can be turned anytime against anybody on our earth. Everybody needs to involve eventually. Thank you, Janelle. My pleasure. What Laura brings about a point is important one to understand in our kind of a list of different perspectives, because Russia is ruled by criminal mafia. It's a mafia state, without a question. For those people that think that Russia has anything to do with communism, you're a little out of date. And nuclear weapons can be turned anytime against anybody on our earth. This is a point where we see a big difference between how people view the situation frankly, in Russian and in English. Because in English, we are convinced that Putin is bluffing and he's not going to use nuclear weapons. And in Russian, they're convinced he will use nuclear weapons and he is crazy enough to do it. And this is why we all must get involved and stop him now. This is a big point. And this is a big important thing to think about. So we, in the United States, historically have been a country of non-interventionalists and staying away. I mean, it took us over 2 years to get into World War II, right? Because World War II started on September 1st, 1939, and we entered in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So, is it a matter of time? If it is a matter of time, what should we do? And if this is a world war, does it mean that everyone's going to get involved eventually? I will end with this point from historian Yuri Filshtinsky, who is an author of a great book of how KGB and how Secret Service in Russia came to power and created the mafia state. Basically almost like a textbook to understand how things developed and what happened in Russia and how the security apparatus from the very beginning of the existence of the country was trying to take over the country. And it was not until the end of past Soviet Union and now into Russian state that the security apparatus was successful at taking over leadership and running the country, which they have been now for the last 20 years. So what Yuri Filshtinsky says is this. If we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to regroup, and the people around him are going to fossilize because he's going to show that he's got another success under his belt from their point of view, and he's going to march on, and there will be no stopping him at that point. So it is really, really important for us to stop Putin while he is in Ukraine. This is a conflict that can very easily, no matter the perspective, it can very easily grow into world conflict. And I think that we live in historic times, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here with you. And as I say to my Russian language viewers, let's outlive Putin, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching. It's been great to spend this time with you today. And I will see you around. Subscribe, hit like, distribute. And thanks to everyone who supports Rashkin Report on Patreon. Yes, you can support Rashkin Report on Patreon platform. There's some questions about that one too. More on that later. All right, I'll tell you a story. I was speaking with a guest from Ukraine, from who is like a war correspondent, I guess, and he spoke very harshly about his concerns. Let's put it say it this way that no, let me rephrase it this way. Ukraine is at war, and we have a person who set up a Patreon account, and he says that Patreon closed his account, saying that he was supporting war. I don't know the particulars, but I think this is something worth looking into because if we have a fundraising effort for Ukraine and all of us are raising funds for Ukraine, and Patreon is closing off this avenue, a very effective avenue for sending money from here to there very quickly, and finds this to be a promotion of war and against them, while at the same time Patreon says that they are ensuring that money of their Russian-based users are going to be protected. It, I would say, at very least, sends a very misleading, provocative, and I would say incorrect message because I think the world is helping Ukraine, and I would like to see Patreon not attempt to stand in the way. But in the meantime, that's where we are. So take care, and until we meet again, this was Yuri Rashkin.